Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am Xavier Salomon, the Peter J. Sharp Chief Curator here at the Frick Collection. As you know, 2014 marked the 400th anniversary of El Greco's death. This extraordinary artist who was born in Crete, learned how to paint, as far as we know, in the European way in Italy, and then moved to Toledo in Spain, where he spent all of his career. Europe and the United States have celebrated this occasion with a number of wonderful exhibitions over the past year, in Toledo and Madrid in Spain, and more recently here in America. The exhibitions El Greco in New York and El Greco at the Frick Collection will be on view at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and here at the Frick Collection until February 1st, the end of the coming weekend. And another show commemorating the anniversary is currently at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, reuniting all the pictures from the Washington area by El Greco until February 16th. Here at the Frick, we have organized a symposium about the collecting of El Greco in America, which took place last Monday. And we have had the pleasure to host lectures on the artist by Jong Ho Park and by Andrew Casper over the last 6 months. It is therefore with great pleasure that I introduce this evening's speaker, a colleague and long-standing friend from London, Dr. Xavier Bray, who will deliver the final El Greco lecture for this anniversary series. Dr. Bray completed his doctoral dissertation on the Royal Religious Commissions as political propaganda in Spain and the King Charles III at Trinity College, Dublin in 1999. Between 1998 and 2000, he was assistant curator at the National Gallery in London, where he co-curated significant exhibitions, such as Orazio Gentileschi at the Court of Charles I in 1998 to 99, A Brush with Nature, the Gear Collection of Landscape Oil Sketches in 1999, and The Image of Christ, Seeing Salvation in 2000. He was also the curator of a memorable in-focus exhibition on Goya's exceptional family of the Infante Don Luis in 2001 and 2002, also at the National Gallery. Between 2000 and 2002, Dr. Bray was chief curator at the Museum of Fine Arts in Bilbao in Spain, and on his return to the National Gallery in 2002 as assistant curator of 17th and 18th century European paintings, he was the co-curator of 3 wonderful monographic exhibitions, first one in 2004 on El Greco, one in 2005 on Caravaggio, and one in 2006 on Velázquez. And he curated his first solo show, The Sacred Made Real, Spanish Painting and Sculpture 1600 to 1700 in 2009. For all of us who were lucky enough to see this exhibition, it will always remain an intense experience and probably the most memorable and groundbreaking exhibition the National Gallery has mounted in the last 20 years. In January 2011, Dr. Bray was appointed Arturo and Holly Melosi Chief Curator at Dulwich Picture Gallery in London, an institution I'm particularly attached to. There, he has overseen major rehangs in the collection and has curated a spectacular exhibition focusing on the relationship between the Spanish artist Murillo and his patron and friend Justino de Neve in 2013, an exhibition which also traveled to Sevilla in Spain. Dr. Bray has been for many years an invaluable colleague and one of the most exciting and thought-provoking curators of my generation in Europe. It is always a pleasure to hear him speak about great works of art with a passion that is often unmatched. He is now working on a major exhibition on Goya's portraits for the National Gallery in London, due to open the autumn of this year, 2015. I have no doubt this will be a fundamental moment in Goya's studies and a very beautiful exhibition. Very few curators have the skills of Dr. Bray when it comes to uniting scholarly depth in exhibitions and very elegant and carefully planned displays. Tonight, Dr. Bray will return to his work on El Greco with a lecture entitled Demystifying El Greco, his use of wax, clay, and plaster models. I would also like to ask you please to turn your cell phones off and also remind you that the lecture tonight will be streamed live on our Frick website and it will be available online for future viewing. Finally, following tonight's lecture, I invite you all to view the El Greco at the Frick Collection exhibition in the Oval Room, which will remain open until 7:30. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Xavier Bray.
Thank you very much, Xavier. Very, very kind and generous introduction. What I'm going to do tonight is tell you about an aspect of El Greco. There are many ways into El Greco, and this is something I realized when I was very fortunate to work with Keith Christensen from the Metropolitan, Gabriele Finaldi from the Prado, and the eminent El Greco scholar in London, David Davies, who happened to be my tutor at University College London. And of course, with El Greco, you can look at the Byzantine tradition and look at his art through this tradition of the post-Byzantine icon painting. He did begin as such. Or you could look at his training in Italy and the way he reacted to the Italian Mannerists working in both Rome and Venice. Or you could go down the route of the proto-modern, or the man who suffered from disease in the eyes and was quite crazy. There are many ways, but what I'm particularly interested in is the studio. What happened when he was at work? What happened when he was thinking, conjuring imaginative ideas for his pictures? And one of these ways for me, are this use of wax, plaster, and clay models, which, as you'll see, did exist in his studio, and how did he use them? And this is what I'm going to try and convert you to. And hopefully, to a certain extent, demystify one of the great spiritual painters that art history has ever produced. So, when the Spanish painter and art chronicler Francisco Pacheco visited El Greco's studio in 1611, this might be El Greco here in one of his paintings of Pentecost. When he visited the studio in 1611 in Toledo, he was shown, and I quote from Pacheco, a cupboard of clay models by his hand, which he used in his works. There is almost no doubt that some of these were the 20 plaster models and 30 clay and wax models listed in the inventory of El Greco's studio, made on his death in 1614. These were passed on to his son, Jorge Manuel, but after his death in 1631, they have not since come to light. Now, in this lecture, I would like to consider how these models may have been used and attempt to determine the role they played in the creation of El Greco's quintessentially otherworldly style. The possibility of El Greco using wax and clay models as visual aids for paintings for his figures is not new. It was first suggested by the great American art historian Elizabeth Duguay-Trappier in 1943, when she noted that one of the angels in particular could be seen from different angles in several of El Greco's compositions. And most recently, Professor David Davies pointed out that El Greco's conscious rejection of live models strengthened the possibility of him using wax models. No real in-depth analysis, however, has ever been done on what these models might have looked like, what function they may have played in El Greco's working procedure, and most important of all, the effect they had on El Greco's final composition. Some artists prefer not to reveal practical techniques that would undermine their creative genius. For example, the great 20th century British artist Francis Bacon kept his drawings and photographs out of public view. And it was only after his death that these were discovered in his studio, and which has been painstakingly reconstructed back in Dublin, which in the end, for art historians, shedded light on his working practice, and most fascinating of all, into his artistic imagination. Now, I do not want to suggest that El Greco kept his clay and wax models a secret. Indeed, this may have been a technique he was quite open about using, which we today do not fully comprehend. But in this paper, I hope to demonstrate how El Greco's use of wax models was absolutely fundamental to his painting, and how his use of sculpture provides a key into his approach in constructing his visionary compositions. As a technique, there is little doubt that El Greco learnt to use models as visual aids during his time in Italy, where it was an established practice among many artists, and that's something I would discuss in a little later. For a painter trained in the post-Byzantine two-dimensional icon tradition, the use of three-dimensional models marked an essential change in the development of his work in the Italianate manner. El Greco's interest in representing three-dimensional objects in paint is apparent early on in his career, however. This is his Dormition of the Virgin, a small icon about this big that was rediscovered in the 1980s in a monastery on the island of Syros in Greece. And it shows Greco's respect for the post-Byzantine artistic tradition of icon painting. Figures are elongated and the drapery is stylized. The gold background gives the scene a spiritual atmosphere. Yet, almost as an act of defiance, El Greco has inserted a golden candelabra in the foreground, providing the viewer with a realistic and tangible object on which to focus. And incidentally, that is exactly where he signs his picture in Greek, and that's how we were able to confirm the attribution to El Greco. Two feminine figures, the third hidden behind, gracefully hold each other by the arm, while the other hold up the vessel on which the candle burns. While El Greco may have indeed based his design on an engraving after a drawing by Raphael and wished to publicize that, in my view, however, he is making a conscious statement that he can paint a three-dimensional object and make it look real. We know that El Greco did use drawings as a means of preparing his compositions, although very few have survived, but it seems logical that these were used in conjunction with sculptural models throughout his career. Drawings such as the St. John the Baptist and St. John the Evangelist, executed in 1577, probably as part of a contract drawing for the altarpiece of Santo Domingo el Antiguo in Toledo, show El Greco thinking in a three-dimensional manner on paper. Using black and brown washes and white chalk, he suggests a space behind the figures into which the shadows are cast. They're almost like niches. Working in grisaille, El Greco may have even been copying from sculptural models in order to better understand the flow of light and the volume of the figures and to define the space they were to occupy. What's interesting is that in the final pictures, he rejects this idea of the niche-like effect and inserts clouds around the figures as a way of creating a sort of heavenly atmosphere, particularly in connection with the other large pictures on that altarpiece. But nevertheless, it just shows you his working process. The interplay between the real and the spiritual worlds was one of El Greco's principal philosophical concerns. But like any artist of his time, he had to begin with a physical concept before creating a vision of the otherworldly. Rather than using life models as a basis for his depiction of the human body, I strongly believe that El Greco fashioned male and female figures, androgynous figures, and angels out of clay, wax, and plaster. These he would then dress with drapery, setting them on an improvised stage, lighting them in different ways, and even hang them by a piece of string so they could comprehend better the effects of foreshortening and composition. Now, whether El Greco made these models himself with his own hands, as Pacheco tells us, is impossible to say. He could have purchased them. He could have purchased sculptural models made by others during his time in Venice and Rome, and then having moved to Spain, taken them with him, or perhaps started making them himself. No wax, clay, or plaster models by El Greco survive today. The only possible exception is a wax model of a crucified Christ, which I was shown about 8 years ago on the art market, and that has some claim to be perhaps by El Greco, or at least used by him. Stylistically datable to the second half of the 16th century. I think, unfortunately, the arms are probably later, but the main part of the body is likely to be late 16th century. And whether by El Greco or contemporary, it is surely inspired by Michelangelo's celebrated drawing of the Crucifixion, which he gave to Vittoria Colonna, and which El Greco could have known from the many copies and engravings after it. When this wax model is juxtaposed with El Greco's Crucifixion with two donors from the Musée du Louvre in Paris, there is a strong and significant connection between it. and the painting much more so, in fact, than between El Greco's painting and Michelangelo's original composition, which is traditionally pointed to be the main source. In the wax model, the muscularity of Michelangelo's crucified Christ is replaced by a sinuous slenderness that is much closer to the way in which El Greco renders Christ's somewhat elongated body in paint. Unlike Michelangelo's crucifixion, El Greco's Christ is also arranged in exactly the same manner as the wax model, with the hips and the head thrust to the viewer's left. El Greco's distinctive technique of using bright highlights to illuminate the undulations of the human form resemble closely the appearance of a piece of sculpture when lit at close range, much more so than the gentle chiaroscuro that an artist such as Michelangelo achieved in his drawings. The best surviving evidence of El Greco's interest in small-scale sculptural figurines are a handful of finished sculptures which have been attributed to him with varying degree of certainty. The most securely attributed pieces are 3 polychromed wood freestanding sculptures, a pair identified as Epimetheus, Pandora, and the Risen Christ. In my opinion, it is questionable whether any of these finished sculptures were actually carved and painted by El Greco's own hand, but what does seem likely is that they were based on El Greco's own plaster and wax models. And from these models, a professional sculptor, a Spanish sculptor, either within his workshop or contracted out, could make copies and would have them painted with color, which of course is a technique common in Spain, that of polychroming sculpture. Now, during the 2004 El Greco exhibition at the National Gallery, we were very fortunate to be able to install next to El Greco's Laocoon from the National Gallery of Washington that you see behind, the 2 polychrome wooden figures of Epimetheus and Pandora from the Museo del Prado. Female figures are less common than male in El Greco's compositions. And of the 2, it was the figure of Pandora that seemed to bear the closest visual comparison with the female figure that appears on the far right of the Laocoon. A further interesting connection between the 2 lies in the fact that following the cleaning of the painting in the National Gallery of Washington in 1955, there emerged a middle head which revealed that El Greco had originally painted the female head in profile, turned to the right. That is exactly in the same direction as the head of Pandora in the sculpture. Ultimately, he changed his mind and painted a second head facing the other direction. There is an even closer connection between the small polychrome sculpture of the Risen Christ and El Greco's painting of the Resurrection. In 1595, El Greco was contracted to make a small sculpture, 45 centimeters high, of the Risen Christ to be placed on top of a tabernacle, which he had also been asked to design for the main altar of the church in Tavera Hospital in Toledo. This was not the first time that El Greco had been asked to provide sculptural adornment or design for one of his religious commissions. However, what is fascinating is that 2 years later, when commissioned to paint a resurrection for the convent of the Encarnacion in Madrid, El Greco decided to reuse the plaster or wax model that he had used for the Risen Christ in Tavera Hospital. For the painted figure of Christ in the Resurrection is identical to the Tavera Hospital Christ. This is not to suggest that El Greco fashioned a figure of Christ after the finished polychrome sculpture, but that perhaps he reused his own preparatory model. Furthermore, the figure of Christ in the painting, who seems to be made of soft white flesh with smooth and polished contours, probably resembles the original appearance of El Greco's clay model. The freestanding nature of these sculptural models could have also helped El Greco achieve this floating nature of his figures, giving his work a peculiarly mystical quality. This is the most definitive example that we have of El Greco using a sculpture as a model for his paintings, but it opens up the possibility that sculptural models were in fact an invaluable source for the artist throughout his career. The practice of using sculptural models as visual aids was not at all uncommon among earlier artists and is referred to in treatises by Cennini in the 14th century and Leon Battista Alberti a century later. And by the 16th century, they were part of everyday studio practice. In his Lives of the Artists, Vasari remarked how, and I quote, "Many masters, before drawing the histories onto the cartoon, make a clay model in a plane and place on it all the round figures to see how the shadows fall, using an appropriate light for this purpose. And from this, the entire history is refined, and the shadows that strike one figure or another are studied. In this way, great perfection, force, and relief are achieved in the works, because the composition is adjusted in the cartoons so that it comes to be well measured and properly arranged." An artist that is famous for using these wax models and setting up a stage is Poussin, the French 17th century artist, to the extent that he actually owned a theater stage that he called himself La Grande Machine, the Great Machine. And there is a fascinating exhibition that unfortunately has just ended at the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge called The Silent Partner, which is all about mannequins in art. And it begins with a wonderful section on wax and clay figures. And of course, I was extremely excited to see this. But they've managed to commission a contemporary artist to reconstruct one of Poussin's great religious paintings, the Extreme Unction, one of the 7 sacraments. And this is what they came up with, this sort of little stage set with figurines inserted, clothed, and the lighting reenacted as a way of studying, as a way of understanding the space. So it just shows that this interest in plaster and wax models is still very much something that is emerging among art historians. Painter studios might have resembled Baccio Bandinelli's Florentine Academy, as portrayed here by Agostino Veneziano in his 1531 engraving. Students study and draw after different figurines in an artificially lit room. In this way, they not only capture the form, but the lightfall of these statuettes. And interestingly, the statuettes cast these wonderful large shadows onto the walls behind. El Greco may have used his figurines in such a way, lighting them by candlelight, and then seeing their effect enlarge against the wall, or even possibly on his canvas. And I just couldn't resist to show you one of the shadows taken from the exhibition that Xavier mentioned, the Sacred Madrigal at the National Gallery. This is a sculpture of the crucifix, a crucifixion by a Spanish 17th century sculptor called Montañez. But the shadow was as powerful as the physical aspect of the sculpture, and hence me photographing it on its own without the sculpture. But it just gives you an idea of how potent such shadows could be within the workshop. In any case, when one sees how these figurines made out of clay, wax, and plaster look all together, as can be seen here in a cabinet at the V&A that sadly no longer exists because this is pre the remodeling of the Renaissance galleries, but you can see that almost a sort of narrative can already be found, and no doubt must have been of great help to artists when thinking of new compositions. One of the most famous artists to use the technique of making clay models was Michelangelo, who made wax, terracotta, and clay models as a way of first visualizing his ideas, be it in sculpture or fresco. The painter and writer, Giovanni Battista Armenini, noted that Michelangelo used wax models to prepare poses for the attitudes of the figures in the Last Judgment. And the best surviving wax model by Michelangelo is this young slave, which he produced as part of the preparatory process for Pope Julius II's tomb. And it's tiny, it's about 10 centimeters high, and seen from different angles, you can see how visually exciting they would have been to not just look at, but also to handle. And I was pointed out by one of your colleagues that you have this beautiful Giambologna wax model in one of the galleries of astrology, which is a sensational piece from a private collection, which I wish I'd known before the lecture, to contrast here with the Michelangelo next time. Now, one of the best records we have of an artist using such figurines is Jacopo Tintoretto, whom El Greco is most likely to have met, or at least had access to his studio when he arrived in Venice between 1568 and 1570. According to Tintoretto's biographer, Carlo Ridolfi, Tintoretto made little models of wax or clay, dressed them in cloth, studied the folds of cloth on the limbs, and placed them in wooden and cardboard constructions, resembling miniature houses, with small lamps alongside to produce effects of light and shade. And then he hung these models from a roof beam so that the effects made by these suspended figures, when seen from below, could be studied and used to compose, I quote, bizarre effects. And here's one of the many drawings by Tintoretto of these figures hanging from the ceiling, taken from below, another one from another side. And Tintoretto, actually, we know, spent considerable sums of money collecting plaster casts of ancient marbles, and had actually even acquired Michelangelo's wax model of Samson and the Philistine, which is unfortunately lost, but known for copies, as well as small models by Daniele da Volterra after Michelangelo's Medici tombs figures in the new sacristy of San Lorenzo, dawn, dusk, night and day, which he made a very special study, doing endless drawings of them by lamplight, using the strong shadows with such light cast to create a powerful, and I quote, emphatic style. And actually, going back to these drawings, you can see how much he enjoyed drawing the plaster model or wax model by Michelangelo from all different angles. And of course, these would have been extremely useful when he came to paint his final composition, such as this wonderful painting of the origin of the Milky Way from the National Gallery. And you can see how these angels taken from different perspectives, how the wax models in the original would have been incredibly useful to achieve such compositions. It seems highly plausible that El Greco used Tintoretto's technique when working on compositions such as his many versions of the Purification of the Temple. I'm here showing you the earliest from the National Gallery of Washington, and as you will know, he treated the same subject throughout his career. His style changed, but the composition essentially remained the same. And once he had decided on the repertoire of the figures he would use, El Greco could have arranged them on a stage and begun painting the composition as a whole, adding, subtracting, moving figures as he saw fit. It is well noted by scholars that Christ's figure in the center of the painting, that sweeping gesture, also used by Michelangelo in his much copied drawing of the same subject, was inspired by the antique figure of Orestes, shown in the act of killing his mother on a sarcophagus in the Vatican collection. And you see this figure here, that sweeping movement. However, what is fascinating is that while he surely did take this antique sculpture as his point of departure, it seems that El Greco introduced an intermediate stage by constructing a clay model of a figure in this pose. And I say this because I'm pretty sure I've located it. And this is pretty much why I started getting so excited by these clay models. In this very large painting of the Immaculate Conception, the Virgin of the Immaculate Conception, which measures about 3 meters high, which was borrowed by the National Gallery back in 2004. If you look in the lower right-hand corner, so I'm going to take you down past the angel's feet, past the roses and lilies. If you look down, there's a little small sculpted figurine arranged in a contrapposto pose on top of that fountain, with the right arm sweeping back over to the over the left shoulder, in exactly the same pose as that of Christ sweeping the money changers out of the temple. In my opinion, this tiny, tiny little figurine is the plaster or clay model that El Greco used for the figure of Christ in his paintings of the purification of the temple, which is, in fact, far closer to the painted figure of Christ than the original Orestes source. If this is correct, and please tell me if you don't think this is right, but this tiny detail would provide us with a rare glimpse of what one of El Greco's clay models looked like, and is probably the closest we are likely to get to their original appearance. There are a number of other examples of El Greco adapting poses from antique sculpture. such as the famous sleeping Ariadne in the Museo Pio Clementino in the Vatican, which reappears as a female figure with one of her arms behind her head in the Purification, this figure here. A looser version of this figure then reappears as one of the sleeping apostles in El Greco's Agony in the Garden. You can see again these arms. And while El Greco may have simply made drawings after such antique sculptures, it is tempting to think that he made or acquired a wax clay model after the antique sleeping Ariadne, which he kept in his studio and could then make subtle adjustments before reinserting it with small modifications into his paintings. For the quotations we see in his work are rarely slavish copies after an original. The refinements and simplifications he made very plausibly with the help of his sculptural models seem to have allowed him to extract the essence of the original form. As well as making models after the antique, it is, in my opinion, that El Greco also had a very good knowledge of Michelangelo's wax and clay models, some of which he may have owned himself. Much has been made of El Greco's awareness of Michelangelo's drawings and finished sculpture, but that he might have been aware of his wax models has been little discussed. As well as those, he may have seen during his time in Italy, perhaps in Tintoretto's studio. He could have had access to the work of Michelangelo, if indirectly, following his arrival in Spain through the work of Michelangelo's Spanish followers, principally little known as artists today, but celebrated in Spain, such as Alonso Berruguete and Nicolás de Vergara el Viejo. El Greco actually had access to the work of Alonso Berruguete, who is one of my absolute favorite sculptors, and I've always wanted to be able to juxtapose these extraordinary sort of elongated forms, such as this Saint Sebastian in the Museo de Valladolid, the extraordinary museum of sculpture, of Spanish sculpture, that very few people visit, but is highly worth the fast train from Madrid to Valladolid. But Berruguete, in a fascinating way, trained with Michelangelo between 1510 and 1520, even winning prizes for his fantastic copies in clay after the Laocoon. And he spent a large part of his career in Valladolid and then in Toledo, where he actually died in 1561, so before El Greco arrived. But some of his best works can still be found in Toledo's churches and convents, as well as the cathedral, and actually kept away from public sight in the cathedral, and I'm afraid I've got terrible 1950s photographs, are two very interesting polychrome wooden reliefs showing the worship of the brazen serpent and the Last Judgment. And both contain twisting muscular figures clearly influenced by the work of Michelangelo. And possibly El Greco saw these reliefs and may even have had access to Berruguete's studio contents, among which may have been a collection of clay and wax models. El Greco almost certainly had access to the collection of models, and I quote from the inventory, plaster, tar, and wax, that belonged to the master sculptor of the Cathedral of Toledo, Nicolás de Vergara. Because after his death in 1574, his son wrote an account of what he had inherited from his father, which included wax and plaster models that his father had made and collected after antique sculptures, such as the Laocoon and Hercules, as well as more contemporary pieces by Michelangelo, among them a model for the resurrected Christ from the Church of Santa Maria sopra Minerva in Rome, and a Michelangelo study of a leg. Now, there is a painting, El Greco's Allegory of the Holy League, a very complicated painting, which is a lecture in itself, but from my point of view, part of it can be seen as a homage, or perhaps an ironic homage to Michelangelo's sculptural models, because in the lower right-hand corner, in the mouth of hell, in the gaping mouth of hell, the male nude is exalted from all angles. So that you know, we have here Philip II, King of Spain, the Pope Pius V, and the Doge of Venice, all praying to the name of Jesus, and those who don't succumb to the Lord will be thrown into hell. And what is in the mouth of hell is absolutely fascinating the more you look into it. Almost as a direct quotation from Michelangelo, for example, is the reclining figure, which you see there. Reclining figure of which is based most likely on the figure of Day in the Medici chapel. The musculature and robustness of the figures is strongly reminiscent of Michelangelo's style, and even the brown coloring and surface texture of the writhing figures look rather like the glistening wax. And I'm just giving you lots of little models that, if you start looking, you can find similar figures in El Greco's Mouth of Hell. This, interestingly, is another version of the same subject, now in the National Gallery. So it's slightly different figurines in the Mouth of Hell. You probably all know that El Greco was quite critical of Michelangelo, and particularly when in Rome he offered to repaint the Last Judgment, take it all down and repaint it in his style. And of course, the local artists were furious, and it is said that El Greco was kicked out from Rome. Perhaps this is his visual revenge on Michelangelo, despite, of course, being a major influence on El Greco. One of the clearest indications that El Greco was using sculptural models in his painting is the fact that we see the same figures appearing over and over again, having been simply turned back to front or turned at 90 or 180 degrees. And often these reappearances take place with a substantial chronological gap between them. For example, the figure that appears here, which I'll show you in a minute, in the middle background of the martyrdom of St. Maurice, which he painted in 5080 for Philip II of Spain, reappears, here's a better detail of this figure, reappears again much later on the right of the Laocoon, this figure here, in the National Gallery of Washington. So he's reusing it some 20 years later. Another clear example of reusing figures appears in El Greco's last work, the opening of the fifth seal. The figure of St. John, with his arms wide apart to reveal to us his vision, adopts a posture that El Greco had already used earlier in his allegory of the Holy League, where among the figures in the background, two figures are in the attitude of exaltation. In the middle background, the resurrected figures receiving the blankets from God, I believe, are all clay models, either taken from different angles, such as this probably is the same figurine, one taken from the front and one taken from the back, or repeated from previous compositions. The naked figure on the far right is exactly the same figure as one of the soldiers in El Greco's Resurrection here in the middle. And funnily enough, when I was researching for this lecture, I came across this very interesting Hellenistic sculpture of Bacchus, now in the Uffizi in Florence. And whether El Greco saw this or another version, I do not know, but they are extraordinarily similar. And this idea of El Greco working from a Bacchic figure to then turn it into a figure in ecstasy is absolutely fascinating. But the most interesting one here is the naked figure in the middle of the figures, with her right hand beneath her left arm, looking upwards. And this is the same woman that, although dressed this time, appears dressed in red and blue, appears as one that posed for the Virgin of the Immaculate Conception, the painting that I showed you earlier. So it's quite interesting to see El Greco's Maja Desnuda and El Greco's Maja Vestida in Goya's style early on. I won't flick too much, I don't want to get you dizzy. But Jorge Manuel, his son, must have kept the clay model for this figure because he reuses it in his own rather bad painting of the Apotheosis of Mary Magdalene, which he painted later in 1620 for a small altarpiece in a place called Titulcia near Toledo. Very few people go there, I'm afraid, but this is the best photograph I could get of the image. By this later stage of his career, I am of the opinion, as you will have guessed by now, that the use of models was fundamental to El Greco in helping him to conceive complicated subjects in paint, even when there was no antique or Michelangelo source to look back to. And in conclusion, for an artist who began his career as a painter of two-dimensional compositions, in which the representation of the body in a realistic way was not a priority, sculpture that represented the beautiful proportions of the human body must have opened new avenues for El Greco's creative powers. Rather than seeking to convey the same effect in paint by working from live models, however, perhaps because of his lack of training in this technique, I believe that El Greco found a solution more appropriate to his needs in working from clay and wax models. By using these pliable materials, El Greco found the freedom to develop his own interpretation of the human form, drawing on both the antique and contemporary sculpture to produce forms that for him represented the essence of the human body. And these he then inserted in his compositions to create his visionary and ecstatic illustrations of the Bible. By purposely not representing the body realistically, El Greco was able to communicate a sense of the immaterial and of the need for individuals to relinquish their physical ties with the world in order to participate more closely in the spiritual world. And what's interesting is that in the 15th century, this man here, Vicente Ferrer, painted by one of the great preachers in Valencia, a Dominican, in his sermons, when he gave his sermons in Valencia in the 1490s, often made the analogy between the Old Testament story of God's creation of man from clay and an artist who made clay or wax figures in preparation for his compositions. And what's fascinating is that Ferrer's nephew was actually an artist, so he very likely saw his nephew at work making these little models, and that's probably what got him going to think about this idea of God the Creator making man from clay. But this Promethean act, of course Prometheus is the great god who was able to fashion, who made man by breathing life into wax and into clay models as well. This Promethean act was surely not lost on El Greco himself, although it is ironic that the qualities of El Greco's supernatural art that we find so mysterious today were in fact reached through very practical means. And so I hope that in this lecture that in some way I've demystified El Greco's work. Thank you very much.
Thank you again. And just a reminder that the exhibition will be open until 7:30.